It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, my partner in crime in the Ligas case here in Illinois, which is now entering its 15th year and still going strong, Bill Choslovsky. Bill's a litigation partner in Ginsberg and Jacobs. As I mentioned, he's worked for 14 years on Ligas. He's done other pro bono work for Misericordia and for other folks all across the country. But his main claim to fame is that he's the brother of Stacy, who's a longtime resident of Misericordia. Bill Choslovsky.
All right. Are you ready to get the adrenaline flowing? I hope so. So, to say I'm excited to be here is an understatement. Forget formal credentials of schools and handling the Ligas case with Scott and other things. My main credential for being here is the same as your main credential for being here. So, I guess if you have a sense of humor, I should start by saying, welcome to the institution. I don't know whether to laugh or cry, and I'm serious. You're sitting in a, quote, institution. 29 beautiful acres of institutional living. There are so many self-proclaimed advocates who would like to shutter the doors here because of an acronym, because of alphabet soup. We just heard these advocates. The reality is, if we're being honest and having a very honest conversation, Misericordia has about 600 residents, 1,000 staff members, world-class care. I'll make up the number. I'll bet you 450 out of those residents, my sister included, could never self-advocate in Washington. So if you want, if you literally walk out that door and go about 50 feet, you'd be at her apartment, where you would see the best in, quote, institutional living. So think about the settings rule that you've heard about. Misericordia had to face it head on. Again, I won't get my numbers exactly right. 600 residents, I think about 400 are ICF residents. We've got, what do we have now, sister? 13 Scylla homes, do I got the number right? 13 Scylla homes, I think 6, 7, 8 residents in each. So we hit the settings rule head on because these residents living integrated in the community, within some a couple blocks from here, some a couple miles from here, nicer homes than most of us probably live in. So for their day, they wake up, they have an independent life. I'm gonna be difficult. Is Miss Harris still in the room? Great. So they, God forbid, they get on, some actually get on a bus. They're very high level functioning. They go to an independent job. Some of them, God forbid, came to, oh, that's right, Misericordia, where they work in that beautiful restaurant about 50 yards from here. Some had different jobs in here. The most integrated, if we're gonna base life on buzzwords, which we shouldn't, they're in the most integrated community I know of. Yet Misericordia had to fight the heightened scrutiny for those, we call them Scylla, community integrated living arrangement, for those waiver residents. We won. How silly, how sad, how unnecessary. So, this is personal for me. I don't apologize for that. Here is my sister, Stacy. She was born, and I like the word, she was born profoundly retarded. If I tell you she's disabled, you don't know whether she has a bad knee or whether she functions at a 1-year-old level, which she does. This was her at her recent staffing. It was on her birthday. My sister came in from Boston. My brother Joel's here, and that's me. Our folks were the ones who were always at this staffing, but they've passed in the last couple years. So now, I don't want to say it's on us, because that suggests it's a duty. There's no duty. So, our journey today, around the DD world in 45 minutes. So fasten your seatbelts, and we're going to take off. I want to cover 4 things. History. I don't care if it's your family. I don't care if it's your country. I don't care if it's this niche thing we're all so invested in. You don't need to be a philosopher with a fancy PhD. It's hard to know where you are now if you don't know your history. So we're going to run through some history, maybe the most valuable thing we do. We're going to talk about Olmstead, a word everybody's heard. We're going to talk a little about P&As, protection and advocacy agencies, one in every state. And finally, we're going to discuss what to do. I mean, we can all talk about problems, but what to do. So let's start with history. Though the disability movement, of course, started before the 60s, a good place to start, if you have to pick a place, is the 60s. President Kennedy, some would give him credit for starting the movement. As I'm sure many in here know, he had a profoundly disabled sister. Rosemary, another sister, Eunice, started the Special Olympics movement. So there's his quote, "We as a nation have long neglected the mentally ill and the mentally retarded. The neglect must end." By the way, this history, as I'm going to go through it, it's all great stuff. I don't think there's anything to argue with until we get pretty close to modern times. So let's run through this. So in 1961, there's the President's Panel on Mental Retardation. Here's the biggie. Here's where everything comes from, the bureaucracy. And I don't mean it in that derogatory fashion, but here's where today's modern state comes from. 1965, Social Security establishes Medicare and Medicaid. That's the big dog. That's the first domino. But this history is relevant. 1967, the number of residents in large state institutions peaks, almost 200,000. I don't think anybody would say that's good. I'm not here to say that's good. 1967, ICFs, intermediate care facilities authorized under Medicaid. Little perspective. I mean, when most people think of Medicare and Medicaid, they think of hospitals or your doctors. So we started with ICFs, intermediate care facilities, to provide, a high level of care for people who need a high level of care. So that's what we started with, ICFs. Again, you're in one of them now. You're sitting in one, an institution. These ICFs were intended to be medically oriented and less expensive form of long-term supports. So the ICFs were the hip alternative to, call it, the state snake pit institutions. They were the trailblazers. So that gives you some history. At least we've made it through the 60s. So let's get to the 70s. The term developmental disabilities is introduced, and it's expanded to cover CP, epilepsy, and other conditions. 1973, this is a biggie, the Rehabilitation Act is rewritten to cover persons with severe disabilities. And what pops up in lawsuits a lot, Section 4 claims they protect the developmentally disabled from discrimination in all federal programs. Anybody against that? I didn't think so. More good stuff. 1975, the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. It mandated access to free, appropriate public education for all children, regardless of the type or severity of disability. This is when we started hearing about IEPs. Practical result is less, quote, kids were placed in ICFs because they could now attend public schools. So far, so good, right? Hard to be against any of this stuff. 1975, here's another biggie. the Developmental Disabilities Assistance and Bill of Rights Act, the DD Act, is passed. This is what established today's P&As. P&As. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that the P comes first. We're going to get to P&As a little bit later in this. P stands for protection. Now, if you really cut to the chase and take a high-level view and put yourself back in 1975 and think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, etc., the P was the most important thing. I mean, the P&As, in theory, they're beautiful, they're wonderful, and they do much good work. I have a problem with them on this niche issue of where they think all disabled people should live. But the P, they were deputized. They were given a badge to make Miss Harris's job a little easier. They were given a badge to make state agencies' jobs a little easier. The badge is they can knock on Misericordia's door today, or really they can barge in, and they can, if they hear of a report, of a scandal, of a problem, they can come kick the tires and make sure no one's being abused, etc. I assume they do that job pretty well. But that was, 43 years ago or whatever. Something's happened on the way to the market, which I'll get into more later. The P's kind of, I don't want to say gone by the wayside, but the P's kind of boring to them. I mean, anybody can protect. Advocacy, that's fun. Social policy, that's where we get our fancy degrees from our universities and all that good stuff. Who has time for protection when we could be advocating? So that was 1975. Again, great, necessary, good system, good in theory. So we're doing great. Let's get to the 80s. I never could do the Rubik's Cube. Another biggie, let's call it the trilogy of biggies. You have Social Security. I'd put this one second, and I would put the DD Act third. You heard some previous speakers say the waiver came in the early 80s. 1981 created Section 1915 of the Social Security Act. This was, again, call it the evolution, was intended to reduce the institutional bias of the Medicaid program. And the first waiver regulations were published in 1985. I don't know if it was called CMS then, but they published their regulations. Now think about it. Let's see if my next slide covers this. This is a biggie. You hear waiver, 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 waiver. What are you waiving from? I'm serious. Even people invested in this, they'll look at me like I'm nuts, or they will shrug their shoulders. Take a half a step back. What are you waiving from when you get a waiver? Of course, you are waiving from, when I say your ICF entitlement, all 50 states, as Ms. Harris said and others, have a state plan. All 50, if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, all 50 states have the ICF. And it's a de facto entitlement. So to get your waiver in just about every state, you need to first be eligible for an ICF. Again, the theory was good in 1981, which is, hey, my kid, they got pretty high needs. Right now, the only things available are these state institutions and these things you folks are now calling ICFs. I don't think they need an ICF. I'd like them with only 4 people, blah, 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 blah. And it was square peg, round hole problem. So again, waiver, great concept. Who could be against it or whatever? But we lose sight that it's dependent upon being entitled to the ICF. And frankly, kind of the elephant in the room that nobody talks about and has caused so many problems is what's really gone on is to be eligible for the ICF level of care. I'm sure it's different criteria in different states, but let's just say you have to check a number of boxes, and you have to be, to cut to the chase, pretty darn needy, as I'll call it. You have to have high needs. So what's kind of happened is in 81, the people who were eligible for ICF level of care, in other words, you're eligible for it, if they were going to divert to a waiver or whatever, they had pretty high needs or whatever. So what's really happened along the way to the market or whatever is in different states, some have said to me, I'll make it personal. The Illinois case, Stanley Liggis, when we got the complaint, I didn't draft the complaint. It's the ACLU's complaint and the Equip for Equalities. Stanley Liggis got on a bus every day, and the line I'll never forget in the complaint, he balances his own checkbook, which some of us have trouble doing. So by all means, should have waivers, but part of the tension nowadays is this notion of the eligibility criterion. But the takeaway here is you are waiving from your ICF entitlement. Oh, this is a good one. I got to quiz you, this next one. So 1981, by definition, every dollar Uncle Sam paid to the DD community for residential services. 1981, waiver. 100% of the people receiving those DD dollars from Uncle Sam for residential services, by definition, were in an ICF. Okay, that's easy. So now we're 40-some years later, or not 40-some years later, we're 37 years later. Quiz question. Today, as we sit here, what out of every 100 people getting, and this is about money, this is about who's paying the bills, that's why there's all these problems. It's through Medicaid, problems and opportunities. Today, 2018, out of every 100 people getting DD funding through Medicaid, how many of the 100 are getting waiver services and how many are getting institutional services? Any guesses? Seriously. Again, in 1981, it was 100% ICFs, 0 waivers. 37 years later, where are we? I heard 70-30. Miss Harris, I'm going to make your life difficult. What's your guess or what's the answer? People, not dollars. People. Out of every 100 people today, how many are getting their services through waivers? Yes. She's very good. She's good at her job. She said high 80s. So courtesy of, since I don't make up my numbers, I think this is the gold standard. Again, Uncle Sam pays these folks a lot of money. This is from the University of Minnesota in-home residential long-term supports and services for persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities, status and trends through 2016. This is the Bible. There's the state academic university centers. This is the Bible. So this is their data. And here's what they say as of 2 years ago. It's going to be a little hard to see this, but punchline, 92%. 92 out of every 100 people receiving Medicaid dollars for DD residential services. And when we say waiver, we got to define the playing field. Most of the people getting waiver services are getting it in their family home. A smaller percentage are getting it in community homes, group homes, SILAs, whatever you want to call them. What I find kind of funny, if you have a sense of humor, and you need one in this arena, is I say to the people fighting the settings rule, welcome to our party. Meaning the ICF folks have been, again, in 1967, the ICFs were the hip trailblazers. We're modern. We're progressive. All of us, and then it became, the waivers, the SILAs. They're the progressive folks or whatever. Well, now they're becoming the dinosaurs. They're fighting all this. So 92 out of how many trivia questions could you win with that? Now, dollars, it's not quite the same, but that's for a number of reasons. It's 77-23. The main ones being, well, there's ones should be self-evident. By and large, of course, there are exceptions. Your mileage may vary. But by and large, people in ICFs have higher needs than waiver folks. Also, a lot of the grouped into the 77-23 for the dollars is it still has a lot of the state facilities, state-run facilities, which have unions and are more expensive. that's why it's 77-23. But people, 92 out of 100. So let's keep going on our journey. I had to interrupt the 80s to tell you that. So now we're in the 90s. The ADA Act is passed. There's 4 titles. The one that's relevant for us that normally we talk about is, of course, Title II, Public Services. And then in 1999, Olmstead. 2000s to present. So, in 2001, by the way, the scale tipped. That's when more dollars started going to waivers as opposed to ICFs. Again, from the Bible. Today, there's more than 500 waiver programs across the country. In the past 20 years, the number of waiver recipients living in their own home has more than doubled. So here's the conclusion. You waiver advocates, you've won. Stop looking at the 8%. It shouldn't be a cannibalization. Of course, in a better world, Ms. Harris was talking about, well, as passionate as you are about your side, and she's right, there's somebody equally passionate on the other side. In a better world, all these different groups would be linking arms and, of course, pointing a common finger at what we'll call the government to grow the pie, not to cannibalize the existing pie. And let me be clear, though this shouldn't be about politics, the current administration is better on these issues than the previous administration. So if everything's relative in this world, I was extremely gratified to see Ms. Harris here. So if you take a big picture perspective, the advocates have won. It's that 100% has flipped to 8%. And at a certain, unless, put it this way, in 1981, if you'd have turned to the trailblazers who came up with the waivers, these pioneers, and you said to them, in 37 years, what do you think the percentages will be? And these were the trailblazers, the people pounding these dioceses. They would have said, you're nuts to think we'd be at 92%. And yet that's what we're fighting over today. Of course, what's lost in all of this isn't whether someone lives in a brown house or a yellow house and calling it a success, moving somebody from a brown house to a yellow house and patting ourselves on the back, from an ICF to a waiver home, and we celebrate. Of course, the bigger issue are what I call the homeless, the people who have no services. They're in neither a brown house nor a yellow house. That's the real problem. So let's run through Olmstead. Like you heard before, it starts with a statute. Congress passes a statute. So you have the statute, no discrimination by public entities. After the statute comes regulations. They pass regulations. So the best hypo I could think of and I'm going to play a clip in a couple minutes that I think is genius, but the best example I could come up with is parents go on a 50-day around-the-world cruise. They leave their kids at home, and they hire a babysitting agency, and they tell the agency, bedtime. Here's the bedtime for our kids. Whatever's reasonable. Okay? So the parents hire a babysitting agency. Their marching orders are, their bedtime is what's reasonable. The agency then comes up with, let's call them some regulations of what's reasonable. Well, if you're 10, it has to be between 8 and 9:30. If you had a sport activity that morning, if your favorite TV show's on that night, you get an exemption, so forth and so on. Okay? Keep laughing. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to CMS because they're put in the middle or whatever. We're going to get to that. So then the agency, remember it's a 50-night cruise you're going on around the world. The agency hires, for all 50 days, a different babysitter each night, 50 different babysitters. Oh, that's right, we have 50 states. I forgot about that. So now these 50 babysitters who show up, there's crazy kids in the house. We got bedtimes. They look at they first say, well, let's start with the statute. It's whatever reasonable. Wow, that's a problem. Oh, what did my agency tell me to do? Oh, my agency gave me, all these pages of regulations. I'm still kind of lost or whatever. So then the agency issues guidance interpreting its own rules. Its own rules. So my punchline is, if you take nothing else from this, so in this situation I just gave you, who should fix the bedtime problem? The parents. In fact, if the parents said to the agency, the bedtime is 10 p.m., you wouldn't need rules passed by the agency. You wouldn't need guidance passed by the agency. The agency probably would like it. It would make the agency's life easier. So we're in this mess because of basically an abdication by the parent, which in this case is Congress. But the good news is, so we just had an advocacy panel. Instead of beating your heads against the wall by running to 50 states or knocking on Ms. Harris's door, and then guidance. Guidance is the wind. Another administration comes, different guidance. I mean, I don't say that derogatorily, I say that respectfully. They're in a tough position. So the solution, to state the obvious, I mean, like the mountain, so high can't go over it, so wide can't go around it, so low can't go under it. I don't know, maybe go through the door. The door is Congress. In one fell swoop, they could fix these issues. So let's run through the Olmstead case. The Olmstead case, the reason I start with the act and the regulations is you don't get to the lawsuit. The only reason you have a lawsuit is because the statute's not clear, and then there's regulations which still have some ambiguity, so you find yourself in court. The relevance of the case is it mostly dealt with psychiatric patients. The Olmstead decision, this is Justice Ginsberg. We confront the question whether the prescription of discrimination may require placement of persons with mental disabilities in community settings rather than in institutions. The answer we hold is a qualified yes. Such action is in order when the state's treatment professionals have determined that community placement is appropriate. The second one's the biggie, this little thing called, choice. The transfer from institutional care to a less restrictive setting is not opposed by the affected individual. It's kind of a biggie, I think, unless you know what's best for everybody in this world. And 3, the placement can be reasonably accommodated. This is you can't rob Peter to pay Paul. This is my line, or maybe I stole it from Sister once upon a time. You don't expand choice for some by eliminating choice for others. That doesn't work. So that's very conservative, backwards Justice Ginsberg. You obviously don't know my sense of humor yet. But here's what Justice Ginsberg wrote. We emphasize that nothing in the ADA or its implementing regulations condones termination of institutional settings for persons unable to handle or benefit from community settings, nor is there any federal requirement that community-based treatment be imposed on patients who do not desire it. No one's going to argue with this. But when you get into the minutia, the weeds, again, on the way to the market, this has been bastardized. Many of these advocates have tried to use this to close institutions. Now, the next slide, Justice Kennedy, who just retired, tell me how smart and prescient is the word, Justice Kennedy was. People read the main opinion, Justice Ginsberg, but he had a concurrence. So he agreed with the result. And listen to this line from Justice Kennedy, absolute genius. This is in 1999. It would be unreasonable. It would be a tragic event then were the Americans with Disabilities Act to be interpreted so that states had some incentive for fear of litigation to drive those in need of medical care and treatment out of appropriate care and into settings with too little assistance and supervision. In light of these concerns, if the principle of liability announced by the court is not applied with caution and circumspection, states may be pressured into attempting compliance on the cheap, placing marginal patients into integrated settings, devoid of the services and attention necessary for their condition. How sadly prescient was Justice Kennedy. This is exactly what has happened. So what does CMS say about those institutions? CMS says states may not limit access to an ICF ID, that's why I call it an entitlement, or make it subject to waiting lists, as they may for home and community-based services. Therefore, in some cases, the ICF service may be more immediately available. Many individuals who require this level of service have already established. And look at, this is from its website. Look at the bottom quote. The ICF is the most comprehensive benefit in Medicaid, and concludes by stating there are few resources like an ICF under any payment source. Phil and Chris earlier said, just one quick line they said, the waiver doesn't include residential. A lot of states cover it in other ways, it doesn't include residential. Where I come from, that's called your home. So again, this ICF, it's the sugar daddy, it's the Cadillac, it's the comprehensive benefit. And yet, as I'll conclude with, it's hidden. It's hidden. In many states, whoever the gatekeepers are, pass agencies, county boards, whoever the different gatekeepers are, and my joke is, or my analogy is, if someone offers you 2 cars today, and one's a Cadillac, 2018 Cadillac, and one's a 1974 Gremlin, or the ICF was 1967, I think. One's a 1967 Gremlin. Would they have to hide the Gremlin from you? I don't think so. I think you'd say, if they took you to the showroom and showed you both of them, you'd say, I'll take the Cadillac. If the Cadillac is half as good as they're telling you, A, they wouldn't have to give you such a sales pitch, and B, they wouldn't have to hide the Gremlin. So P&As, again, 1975, great creation, necessary, great in theory. What's the concept of the A portion, advocacy? They receive millions of federal dollars, unlike Sister, who has to go out and raise $18 million a year to cover her deficit, and same with you folks. They get our tax dollars, and it's real simple. They're supposed to advocate, nothing wrong with that, for all disabled people. My sister's supposedly their constituent. So some of the things they're supposed to do under the statute, this is the minutia or whatever, but again, they're supposed to educate about all services, advocate for everybody, so forth and so on. The DD Act also requires that the P&A have a governing board composed of members who broadly represent the needs of individuals in the system. Check your P&A. Find out how many of their board members have an affiliation, meaning a loved one, whatever, or with an institution. This is their statute. This is why they get millions of dollars. They're supposed to advocate for all. And what makes it so dangerous, I don't mind a well-defined debate. You say up, I say down, we can have a fair fight, we can draw a line, no problem. We can try to persuade each other. So many of these P&As, my father used to say that the more dangerous than your enemy, he was a wise man, is your false friend. And these P&As are masquerading as our friend, and what makes them so dangerous is the press and politicians don't know better. They stand up, there's one per state. I mean, think about this. What do you say every few years? Vote the bums out, right? You don't like your politician, you vote them out. Supreme Court justices, they die eventually. Okay? Your P&A, forever. Millions of dollars forever. They don't report to anybody. You can't throw them out. Does anybody know of an instance of a P&A being replaced? I mean, it's crazy. So that's what's going on. That's what's been going on. And it's a Trojan horse. Again, if they defined it and said, if we set up and they said down, but they masquerade as pretending to represent our interests when they're actually many times throwing us under the bus. Let me be clear. P&As do some great work. And I say it anytime I see the P&As. They used to have they have to have an annual meeting. They stopped having it in Illinois. They do it virtually now because the Misericordia folks would show up and tell them how bad they do their job. So therefore, they stopped having the annual meeting. But I would say to them when I would get there, I'd say, you have 100 things to cover. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I don't know, but I assume 99 of them, I assume you do great. Transportation, Braille on ATM machines, whatever. I'm sure you knock it out of the park. But on this issue, where our most vulnerable should live, you don't have it right. I don't tell you what's right. Why do you tell me what's right? Let alone when you are claiming to represent me and getting millions of dollars to do so. If the shoe was on the other foot, it would be on 60 Minutes. So what to do? To set this up, it's kind of my example I gave with the babysitting. I thought this was genius. I don't care what your politics are. Somebody sent me this clip. It frames things so beautifully. So Ron, if you could roll the first clip. Please, Ron.
How do we get to a place where the legislature decided to give away its power? We've been doing it for a long time. Over the course of the last century, but especially since the 1930s and then ramping up since the 1960s, a whole lot of the responsibility in this body has been kicked to a bunch of alphabet soup bureaucracies. All the acronyms that people know about their government or don't know about their government are the places where most actual policy making, kind of in a way lawmaking, is happening right now. This is not what Schoolhouse Rock says. There's no verse of Schoolhouse Rock that says give a whole bunch of power to the alphabet soup agencies and let them decide what the governance decision should be for the people, because the people don't have any way to fire the bureaucrats. And so what we mostly do around this body is not pass laws. What we mostly do is decide to give permission to the secretary or the administrator of bureaucracy X, Y, or Z to make law-like regulations. That's mostly what we do here. We go home and we pretend we make laws. No, we don't. We write giant pieces of legislation, 1,200 pages, 1,500 pages long, that people haven't read, filled with all these terms that are undefined, and we say the secretary of such and such shall promulgate.
Okay, genius. He gets it right. Go to the second clip, Ron, please.
Detail, but the real reason at the end of the day that this institution punts most of its power to executive branch agencies is because it's a convenient way for legislators to have to be able to avoid taking responsibility for controversial and often unpopular decisions. If people want to get reelected over and over again, and that's your highest goal, if your biggest long-term thought around here is about your own incumbency, then actually giving away your power is a pretty good strategy. It's not a very good life, but it's a pretty good strategy for incumbency. And so at the end of the day, a lot of the power delegation that happens from this branch is because the Congress has decided to self-neuter. Well, guess what? The important thing isn't whether or not the Congress has lame jobs. The important thing is that when the Congress neuters itself and gives power to an unaccountable fourth branch of government, it means the people are cut out of the process.
And let's do the last one short. If you could roll that, Ron. Thank you.
And so ultimately, when the Congress is neutered, when the administrative state grows, when there is this fourth branch of government, it makes it harder and harder for the concerns of citizens to be represented and articulated by people that the people know that they have power over. All the power right now, or almost all the power right now, happens off stage. And that leaves a lot of people wondering who's looking out for me. And that.
So, I think that's genius. Again, it goes to nobody should be yelling at Ms. Harris, though it comes with the territory, whoever is in her position. And again, I view the current agency as an improvement. Like my babysitting example, the parents need to set the bedtime. Or applied here, Congress needs to do its job. So instead of lobbying 50 state legislatures, and then they have 50 agencies within those states, So now you're at 50, and then instead of going to CMS and sub-agencies go to the parent. Make them fix the problem. That's where, in my mind, the solution lies. I mean, maybe that's naive, maybe that's aspirational, but we should give it a shot. I mean, somebody should write the dream statute. Doesn't mean we're going to pass it, but wouldn't it be nice to know what the ask is? And run around with it and say, what's the principled objection to this or whatever? I presume CMS would like that. It would make their life easier. So they'd have certainty. So what to do? I've kind of answered it. I think that's the global answer. I mean, we can continue to bang our heads against the wall. We have to in some ways. You'll fight these things onesie by onesies. But that, to me, is the main solution. Other things we can't fight. I mean, people define this debate with a few words. Institution versus community. Segregate versus integrate. We have to reclaim our identity, whatever type of facility you're in. I mean, it's nonsensical. This beautiful campus of ours, I don't know, we've got ICFs, we've got SNFs, we've got community facility. I'm supposedly an expert. I don't know the acronyms. So, and the average parent, when you're looking to find a place for your kid, when my parents, my physician father and my mom, who couldn't see enough places when the time came, she ran around the whole country. Do you think they care whether something's called an ICF or a SILA? Or nobody cares. That's my message to you, Ms. Harris. Nobody cares. They want the people who care are the people who, they're in an ivory tower and they have all the answers because this is an academic matter. But the people who are most vested, nobody cares about an acronym. What? The place is great because it's 6 beds and it's terrible because it's 10. Last night's keynote speaker, Rob Johnson, great guy. He was talking about the facility his brother's in Arkansas, Easter Seals. It's 10 beds. I felt like saying to him, Rob, I hate to break it to you, but most of the advocates in this country, the P&As getting millions of dollars. Many of the ARC chapters. I'm so happy to see ARC of Jacksonville as a sponsor. That's great. That's progress. But many of these advocates, I don't think he knew it. If they had their way, they would shut the home his brother's in because there's 10. He's institutionalized his brother. What a terrible guy. So another thing you can do in Ohio, just last month, there's a woman in the audience here who, I think this is the right generation of people. Remember the movie Erin Brockovich? Okay, this woman makes Erin Brockovich look like a slacker. She's not quite in Sister Rosemary League, but that's an impossible standard. But she's a mom. She has 3 kids. Her oldest, her son, is in college, and then she had twins, Henry and Elizabeth. And she lives in Ohio. Her twins were born profoundly disabled. They function at less than a 1-year-old level. And she's placed her children, since they were very young, in an ICF, and they receive fantastic care. It's her choice. She couldn't be more committed. Well, in Ohio, just like in Illinois a dozen years ago, the P&A, Disability Rights Ohio, after getting about 90% of what they wanted from the state of Ohio, they made demands on the state of Ohio. And after Ohio blinked and gave them 90% of what they wanted, DRO said thank you by, that's right, still suing the state of Ohio. So we've intervened in the case, we being people who have guardians, moms, dads, brothers, sisters, who have loved ones at these ICFs, and we're taking on, we're the first people to try doing it, the P&A itself, for not representing the interests of all disabled people. It's an uphill battle. No one's ever done it for a reason. And who knows how it will go. But to show you how incestuous all of this is. So DRO, the P&A in Ohio, sues the governor of Ohio and 3 agencies in Ohio that are responsible for administering programs. Okay? They sue them. Just last month, the governor of Ohio, who's being sued, appoints the executive director of DRO to the board of two of the other agency defendants in the case. That doesn't strike you as odd? I mean, if your company's being sued by someone, do you have the person suing you join your board of directors or whatever? So it is so incestuous, and this shows you what we're up against here. But in terms of what you can do, I don't recommend it. I think this is the absolute worst way to change policy, the worst way. By the way, we didn't file this lawsuit. DRO filed the lawsuit in 2016. But once they brought it and were claiming to represent, Caroline Larman, stand up. She's in the back. I see her. Stand up. These advocates don't have the integrity and fight she has in her pinky exceeds what all these other folks have. She didn't want this lawsuit. Nobody wants to be political. Nobody wants to learn these alphabet soup names or whatever. It's unfortunately by necessity. So that's it. That's my presentation. We should walk tall as a group. We have nothing to apologize for. And again, we should walk tall. I want to walk tall with you. Thank you.